She was 3 points from history when she stopped mid-serve, ball still bouncing at her feet, and simply walked off the court. No injury, no argument with the umpire, no explanation, just silence. And 18,000 people in the stands who didn't know whether to gasp or applaud because nobody, not even her own coaching team, saw it coming. What happened in the tunnel afterward would only surface weeks later in a video nobody was prepared for, and by then the question wasn't why she left the court, it was whether she was ever coming back. For 3 years, Mara Voss had been tennis's most carefully engineered success story, the kind of rise that gets written about in breathless headlines before anyone stops to ask what it actually costs. She'd been pulled out of a small coastal academy at 15, flown across an ocean, handed a racket bag stitched with a sponsor's logo before she'd even finished growing into her serve. By 19, she was cracking the top 30. By 20, she was a name broadcasters said with a little extra weight in their voice, the way you talk about someone you expect to be famous for a long time. Her forehand had a signature whip to it, a kind of violence dressed up as elegance, and crowds had started arriving early just to watch her warm up. She was, by every visible measure, exactly where the plan said she should be. But plans don't account for what happens inside a person while the outside keeps performing on schedule. What nobody watching from the cheap seats or the television broadcast could see was the schedule underneath the schedule, the one that never had a day off in it. Airports blurred into hotel rooms, blurred into practice courts, blurred into more airports. An itinerary built for a body that needed to hold up, and a mind that was never asked how it was doing. She'd smile in the media room, she'd sign the visors, she'd post the highlight reel with the caption everyone expected, and underneath it, something had started to go quiet in a way that felt different from tired. 2 weeks before the walk-off, people who followed her closely started noticing something was off, though none of them could quite name it. The training clips stopped, the captions got shorter, then stopped meaning anything at all. A scheduled press conference got moved, then moved again, then quietly disappeared from the tournament's media calendar without a word. Fans filled the silence with their own theories, the way fans always do when the story goes dark. Some said it was her shoulder again, the one she'd tweaked in the spring. Others whispered that the fire had gone out of her, that maybe the rise had simply run its course, that this was what a plateau looked like from the inside. Nobody guessed the truth, because the truth wasn't a story anyone in that sport had learned to tell yet. The walk-off itself lasted maybe 4 seconds. Cameras caught her lowering the racket, catching the second ball as it dropped, and turning toward the tunnel with an expression that didn't match anything she'd shown the public before. Not triumph, not frustration, just a kind of exhausted clarity, like someone who has finally stopped arguing with themselves. The commentators didn't know what to say, neither did her opponent, who stood frozen at the net, unsure whether to celebrate a walkover or worry about what she'd just watched. For a full week afterward, there was nothing. No statement, no agency press release, no coach doing damage control on a sports network, just a canceled schedule and a growing, uncomfortable quiet that made the absence louder than any announcement could have. Then the video appeared, uploaded with no warning, no promotional lead-up, nothing but a plain backdrop and a young woman sitting closer to the camera than any of her usual polished content ever allowed. She looked different, not unwell exactly, but stripped of the performance she'd built her public self around, the practiced ease she used in every interview since she was 16. Her voice, when she started speaking, cracked in the first sentence, and she let it crack, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd fought to keep it steady. She talked about the loneliness of hotel rooms in cities she couldn't have named a decade earlier, the particular ache of celebrating a win with nobody in the room who'd known her before any of this started. She talked about a version of fear that had nothing to do with losing a match and everything to do with disappointing people who'd built their own hope around her, strangers who felt entitled to a piece of her simply because they'd cheered for her once. She said the game that used to feel like flying had started to feel like a treadmill she couldn't get off of, one that sped up every time she tried to catch her breath. And then, quietly, without the dramatic flourish anyone expects from a career-altering confession, she said she was stepping away, not retiring, stepping away for as long as it took to remember why she'd picked up a racket in the first place. The reaction split the internet in a way that surprised almost everyone who'd predicted it would go the other direction. There's a familiar script for athletes who step back at their peak, a script full of words like squandered and soft and ungrateful, and plenty of people expected that script to play out here too. Instead, Instead, something else happened. Comment sections that usually traded in cruelty started filling with something closer to recognition. People who'd never watched a single match of hers started sharing the video anyway, tagging friends, writing about their own versions of the treadmill she'd described, the ones that didn't come with a trophy at the end but felt exactly as suffocating. Fellow competitors, including some who'd only ever spoken to her in brief handshakes at the net, posted messages of support that read less like performative solidarity and more like relief, as if she'd said out loud something several of them had been carrying alone for years. It became almost overnight less a story about one athlete's crisis and more a mirror held up to an entire industry that had quietly normalized burning young people out in public and calling it dedication. What made the moment land the way it did wasn't just her honesty. It was the timing of it and the way it forced a conversation that had been circling the sport for years without ever quite breaking through. Coaches who'd spent decades building players like products started getting asked harder questions in interviews. Parents who'd been pushing their own kids through youth academies found themselves rethinking what success was supposed to look like at 14, at 15. Sponsors who'd built entire campaigns around her relentless work ethic had to sit with the uncomfortable fact that the same quality they'd marketed as inspiring had also been the thing quietly breaking her. It's rare for a single moment to reframe an entire culture's relationship with pressure, but for a strange, charged stretch of weeks, that's what this felt like. An entire sport looking at itself in a mirror it usually kept turned to the wall. And yet, underneath all of that noise, something quieter and more interesting was happening to her personally, something the headlines mostly missed because it didn't fit the neat arc of collapse and redemption they were racing to write. She wasn't disappearing, she was recalibrating. In the weeks after the video, away from tournaments and rankings and the specific tyranny of a draw sheet, she started doing things that had nothing to do with tennis at all. Small things, the kind that don't make highlight reels. She learned to cook a dish her grandmother used to make, badly at first, then less badly. She spent an entire afternoon reading a book that had nothing to do with sports psychology or performance optimization, just a novel, chosen because the cover looked interesting. She let herself be bored, which for someone whose entire adolescence had been scheduled down to the hour felt almost radical. Sports psychologists who study burnout in young athletes have long pointed out that the ones who recover best aren't the ones who grit their way through exhaustion, but the ones who allow themselves an honest stop long enough to rebuild a relationship with the sport that isn't purely transactional. What looked from the outside like a career unraveling was, from the inside, something closer to a system finally being allowed to breathe. There's a pattern experts have noticed across decades of watching young prodigies rise too fast in physically brutal sports. A pattern that repeats itself often enough that it stops surprising anyone who studies it closely. The ones who burn brightest earliest are frequently the ones who flame out soonest, not because they lacked talent, but because talent was never the limiting factor. The limiting factor was almost always the absence of a stop button, the assumption baked into every training plan and every media obligation that ambition and exhaustion were supposed to look identical. The athletes who last, the ones who are still playing meaningful tennis into their 30s long after their peers have faded, are disproportionately the ones who learned, often the hard way, to build in the pause before their body or mind forced one on them. Seen through that lens, what Mara did wasn't a collapse at all. It was closer to the smartest tactical decision of her career, a decision most players never get the clarity or the courage to make until it's already too late. None of this erased the very real risk she was taking. Rankings don't wait for anyone's recovery, and every week away from competition meant points lost, seeding dropped, a slower climb back into contention whenever she chose to return. There were no guarantees stitched into her decision, no safety net beyond her own resolve, but there was something else building in that uncertainty too, something less visible than a ranking number but arguably more durable. Her honesty had reframed how people understood her, shifting her from a name attached to statistics into someone whose story people actually cared about beyond the scoreline. That kind of connection, the kind built on vulnerability instead of highlight reels, tends to outlast a single disappointing season in ways that pure winning never quite manages. It doesn't show up in a rankings algorithm, but it shows up in the way a crowd reacts the first time she walks back onto a court, in the kind of ovation that has nothing to do with the score, because she will walk back onto a court. She said as much herself in that same shaky, unpolished video that started all of this, that the love for the game hadn't disappeared, only the version of the game that had stopped belonging to her. Somewhere in the space between one match and whatever comes next, there's a version of her that gets to choose why she plays again, instead of simply being carried along by a schedule built for someone else's expectations. That return, whenever it comes, will not be the same story it would have been 6 months ago. It won't be a comeback built on redemption from failure, because nothing about this was a failure. It will be a return built on someone finally understanding the difference between quitting and choosing, between running from something and walking deliberately back toward it. And when that day comes, when she finally steps back onto a court that's waited for her, the 4 seconds that once made an entire stadium go quiet will mean something completely different than they did the first time. Not an ending, a pause long enough to remember what she was playing for in the first place, and a beginning that nobody, not the commentators, not the fans, not even she herself in that raw and unscripted video could have fully predicted the shape of. But the story doesn't end with her walking away, because stories like this rarely do, and the months that followed revealed something almost nobody had anticipated when the video first went up. 3 weeks after the confession, a photographer caught her almost by accident on a public court in a quiet suburb far from any tournament, hitting balls against a wall with no coach in sight, no cameras arranged, no sponsor logo stitched anywhere on her clothes. It wasn't a polished training session, it was messy and unguarded, the kind of hitting a person does when nobody's grading it, and the image, once it leaked online, did something the confession video hadn't quite managed. It made people believe her, not just sympathize with her, not just admire the courage of the admission, but actually believe that whatever she'd said in that video was real and ongoing, not a temporary detour dressed up as a growth. There's a particular kind of skepticism that follows any public figure who steps back and calls it healing, a quiet chorus wondering whether the whole thing is calculated, a narrative arc built for sympathy before an eventual triumphant return. That photograph killed the skepticism almost instantly, because nobody stages themselves looking that unfinished. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected started happening in youth academies far from where she trained, the kind of ripple effect that rarely gets attached cleanly to a single cause, but that coaches and parents began noticing all the same. Programs that had never once discussed a player's mental load as seriously as their backhand technique started building in rest days that weren't contingent on injury. A handful of academies quietly changed their travel schedules for their youngest prodigies, trimming the brutal itineraries that used to be treated as simply the cost of doing business. None of it was announced as directly connected to her, because these things rarely are, but the timing was hard to miss. And more than one coach admitted off the record that watching a rising star of her caliber say the quiet part out loud had given them permission to ask questions they'd been avoiding for years. It's worth pausing here on what made her admission different from the dozens of vague athlete statements that get released every season, the ones full of gratitude and vague references to personal reasons that explain nothing and satisfy no one. She hadn't hidden behind euphemism. She'd named the exact mechanism of what was breaking her: the loneliness, the fear of disappointing people who'd never even met her, the way winning had stopped feeling like anything at all because there was no time left over to feel it in. That specificity is what turned a routine athlete withdrawal into something people couldn't stop talking about, because specificity is what makes a stranger's pain recognizable as your own. A person scrolling past yet another vague statement moves on without a second thought. A person who reads an exact detailed description of a treadmill that never slows down. A person who has felt that particular flavor of exhaustion themselves in an office or a classroom or a kitchen at midnight. Stop scrolling. That's the difference between a headline and a mirror. And for a few strange weeks, an entire online audience that had never cared about tennis rankings found themselves staring into one. Meanwhile, away from the noise, the actual mechanics of her recovery looked far less cinematic than anything trending online. There were mornings, according to people close to her circle, where she simply didn't feel like doing anything at all, and instead of forcing a session or faking productivity for the cameras that no longer existed, she let those mornings be exactly what they were. There were sessions with a psychologist that had nothing dramatic about them, just slow, unglamorous conversations about what parts of the sport she still loved and which parts she'd absorbed only because everyone around her had insisted they were necessary. Some days she picked up a racket purely because her hands missed the weight of it, hitting for 20 minutes with no drill, no coach's whistle, no purpose beyond the simple physical pleasure of contact, and then stopping the moment it stopped feeling good. Other days she didn't touch a court at all, and nobody around her treated that as a setback, which itself marked a quiet revolution in how her team had started operating. The old model measured progress in hours logged and matches simulated. The new one measured it in whether she woke up wanting to be there at all. It's easy watching from a distance to romanticize a pause like this, to frame it as a clean narrative of struggle followed swiftly by clarity. But the truth, as usual, was messier than that. There were setbacks in her recovery that never made it into any headline. Stretches where the anxiety she'd described in the video came back sharper than before. Moments where stepping onto even a practice court felt like standing at the edge of something she wasn't ready to face. Nobody rushed her through those moments. That, more than the viral video or the wall of public support, might be the actual turning point of this story. The quiet decision by everyone around her to stop treating her recovery as a countdown clock to her comeback and start treating it as something with its own timeline entirely, indifferent to tournament calendars and ranking deadlines. It's the kind of patience that professional sports rarely extends to anyone, and the fact that it existed here at all says something about how much the conversation had genuinely shifted, not just online, in comment sections and hashtags, but inside the actual rooms where decisions about her career were being made. As for the sport itself, life went on the way it always does when a single competitor steps away. Other rivalries filled the vacuum, other young players climbed the rankings she'd vacated, other storylines took over the broadcasts that used to feature her. There was no dramatic void left hanging over every tournament in her absence. No sense that the sport had stopped because she had. And in a strange way, that was exactly the point. The world she'd once felt she couldn't disappoint kept turning without her, proving in the most undeniable way possible that the catastrophic weight she'd been carrying, the fear that everything would collapse the moment she stopped delivering, had never been real in the first place. It had been a story she was telling herself under pressure, and pressure, it turns out, tells convincing stories. Removing herself from the equation didn't end the sport. It simply gave her room to discover that her worth had never actually been contingent on it continuing to need her every single week. When she eventually did return, quietly, without a press conference or a produced comeback narrative, entering a smaller tournament far from the spotlight of the majors, there was no guarantee of an immediate triumph, and there wasn't one. She lost in the second round, in straight sets, to an opponent ranked well below where she used to sit. The old version of that headline would have read like a tragedy, further proof of decline, a cautionary tale about stepping away too long. Instead, the footage that circulated afterward showed her walking off that court smiling, shaking her opponent's hand a beat longer than tournament etiquette required, looking for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, like someone who had simply enjoyed playing a match of tennis. That image, more than any statistic, became the actual ending audiences wanted. Not a trophy, not a ranking milestone, but a person visibly at peace with a result that used to feel unbearable. It's a strange kind of victory that never shows up in a record book, and it might be the only kind that actually lasts.